Archive 13, Shadows on the Volga. The Case of Vladimir Mukhankin, the Saratov Strangler. Introduction. A woman named Anna Petrova walked home from the night shift at the textile mill on a street where the street lamps had burned out 3 weeks earlier. She was 31 years old. She had worked the mill for 9 years and was saving to visit her sister in Volgograd the following spring. She carried a paper bag with 2 loaves of bread and a small packet of sugar she had saved from her rations. The air smelled of river mud and coal smoke. 2 blocks from her building, a man stepped from a doorway. He asked her for a light. She stopped, because that was still what people did in Saratov in 1995. The man walked beside her for half a block. Then he took her by the throat and dragged her between 2 apartment blocks. He used his hands until she stopped moving. He cut away her clothing with a pocket knife and removed her liver and both breasts. He wrapped the pieces in the paper bag she had been carrying and left the rest of her on the ground. The bread and sugar remained beside her body. The bread and sugar remained beside her body. The district investigator wrote in his notebook that the attack appeared sexual and that the missing organs suggested the work of a single perpetrator. He filed the report under ordinary criminal violence. The case received no special number. Mukhankin was already living in the same district. He worked occasionally at the railway depot, unloading freight. Neighbors remembered him as quiet and polite. He kept a small room with a hot plate and a single bed. On the wall, he had pinned a calendar from the previous year. The archives contain no record of what he wrote on the empty squares. Nothing. That is what makes it worse. The next body appeared 4 months later. The same pattern, the same removal of organs, the same use of hands rather than ligature. Detectives noted the similarity, but lacked laboratory resources to compare fibers or blood types across districts. Paperwork moved slowly between stations. Telephone lines between Saratov and Moscow remained unreliable that winter. By the 3rd killing, the city administration had begun to receive letters from citizens asking why the cases remained unsolved. The letters were filed. No task force was formed. The investigation continued under the same 2 detectives who handled thefts and domestic disputes. Mukhankin continued to report to work. He spoke little. He ate his meals alone. When asked about the murders, he said only that the streets were no longer safe after dark. Colleagues later told investigators that he appeared calm during these conversations. The 5th victim was found in a park near the Volga embankment. Her name was Elena Morozova. She was 28 years old and worked as a pharmacy assistant. She had been saving money in a glass jar for a winter coat. The jar remained in her coat pocket when the body was recovered. The coat itself was never found. She had been saving for a coat she would never wear. Investigators began to suspect a single offender after the 6th killing. They compared the locations on a paper map pinned to the wall of the district station. The pins formed a rough circle around Mukhankin's neighborhood. One detective remarked on it over tea. The remark was not recorded in any official log. No one acted on the observation for another 8 months. The arrest occurred in October 1997, after a witness saw a man matching the rough description leaving the scene of an attempted attack. Mukhankin was taken into custody at his room. Inside a metal box under the bed, police found pieces of human tissue wrapped in newspaper. He made no attempt to resist. He gave his name and address without being asked. He described the killings in detail during interrogation. He stated that he experienced an urge that began as a pressure behind his eyes and ended only after he consumed the organs. He said the urge returned every few weeks. He could not explain why he kept the remains. Court records show he answered every question without emotion and without once asking for counsel. The trial lasted 11 days. He was convicted on 7 counts of murder and sentenced to death by firing squad. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment following Russia's moratorium on capital punishment. He remains in a penal colony in the Urals. He has granted no interviews since 2001. He remains in a penal colony in the Urals. He has granted no interviews since 2001. Court records show he answered every question. 8S. The question that remains is whether the police could have identified him after the 3rd killing if the district stations had shared records in real time. Whether Anna Petrova might have been the last rather than the first. That question has no comfortable answer. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many more bodies lie beneath the Saratov streets. Break time trims 1.5 seconds. Anna Petrova's body lay between two buildings for 9 hours before a resident noticed the exposed skin in the early morning light. The alley smelled of wet brick and old rust. A cat had been at the edges of the scene before anyone arrived. The investigator on duty came with a single photographer and a notebook already half full from an earlier burglary call. He recorded the position of the limbs and the absence of clothing. He noted the missing sections of the torso without further comment. The photographer took 6 exposures on black and white film. The film was developed 2 days later because the darkroom technician had gone home early. 6 photographs, 2 days, 9 hours in an alley. The report reached the city prosecutor's office the following week. A clerk stamped it and placed it in a folder marked Unsolved Sexual Assaults. No copy was sent to the Criminal Investigation Department because the department had no separate file for serial offenses at that time. The folder remained on a shelf until the second body appeared. In post-Soviet Russia during the mid-1990s, many regional police departments lacked standardized protocols for cross-district case comparison. Budgets had been slashed following the collapse of the Soviet state. Forensic laboratories in cities like Saratov operated with equipment more than 15 years old. Blood typing, not DNA analysis, remained the primary biological investigative tool in most regional cases. Mukhankin returned to his room after the first killing and washed his hands at the sink. The water from the communal pipes ran cold that time of year. He boiled water on the hot plate and ate a portion of what he had taken. He then slept for 6 hours. When he woke, he went to his shift at the depot. He carried his canvas work bag. He spoke to no one about the previous night. The archives contain no record of whether he experienced any physical reaction during the following days. That silence is its own kind of answer. The second victim was found in a different district 4 months later. Her name was Olga Semenova. She was 34 years old, a nurse's aide at City Hospital No. 3, and the mother of a 12-year-old son named Pavel. She had left her apartment at 10:30 to buy milk from the kiosk on Lenina Street. The distance between the two crime scenes was 4 kilometers. The same organs were missing. The same method of manual strangulation had been applied. The detective assigned to Olga Semenova's case did not request the file from Anna Petrova's case because he was not aware it existed. Myth versus reality. The popular assumption is that Soviet-era Russian police were highly centralized and efficient in sharing criminal data. The reality in post-Soviet transition was the opposite. By 1995, many regional departments had lost their structured communication infrastructure. Records were physically transported between stations by courier or simply not transported at all. The central criminal database that the Soviet MVD had maintained was in the process of being restructured and was largely inaccessible to district-level investigators in cities like Saratov during this period. A break time is 0. 8S. 2 women were already dead, and no one in the building where Olga Semenova had lived could say which detective to call. 2 women dead, 2 separate files, 2 detectives who had never spoken. The city moved through its ordinary October. Coal smoke settled low over the river. Trams ran late. The ration lines outside the bread cooperative on Chapayeva Street stretched half a block each morning, and Mukhankin continued to report to work. By the 4th killing, the 2 detectives who had separately handled the earlier cases found themselves at the same canteen table purely by chance. One had come to the central station to collect a different file. The other was eating a late lunch of black bread and tinned fish. They began to talk. By the time the tea arrived, they had the files laid side by side on the Formica table. The pattern was visible immediately, visible and deeply inconvenient. They brought a paper map of Saratov back to the station wall. 4 colored pins. The cluster was unmistakable. A rough circle centered on the railway depot district, the textile mill corridor, and the embankment walks along the Volga's western bank. One detective said aloud that whoever was doing this lived inside that circle. He was correct. His partner wrote nothing down. No official log entry was made. No supervisor was informed that afternoon. In 1997, criminologist Viktor B. Petrov, who later analyzed the case for the Journal of Russian Criminology, wrote that this informal recognition moment represented a catastrophic institutional failure. The 2 investigators had enough information after the 4th victim to justify a task force and a canvass of the cluster zone. The fact that the conversation happened over lunch and produced no documentation tells us everything about the resource environment these men were working in. They were not incompetent, they were invisible to their own system. Mukhankin continued to work at the depot throughout this period. He operated a hand truck moving crates of machine parts along the loading dock. Supervisors described him as reliable and silent. He never requested time off after the killings. He was never late. When the night shift ended, he walked home along routes that investigators would later establish passed within 1 or 2 blocks of 4 of the 7 crime scenes. He walked home through the evidence every night. He walked home through the evidence every night. The pressure behind his eyes returned at irregular intervals. Court testimony later established that he sometimes waited weeks between urges and sometimes only days. He selected victims who walked alone after dark. He approached them with a question, a light, directions, the time. The opening was always mundane. The archives record no variation in the method across all 7 confirmed cases. There was no escalation in the approach, no change in the script. Fact: FBI behavioral analysis of organized offenders in similar cases notes that a consistent, scripted approach to victim contact is a marker of what the Bureau classifies as a mixed organized offender, one who plans the initial contact but allows circumstance to dictate the specific victim. Mukhankin fits this profile precisely. He did not hunt specific women. He hunted the conditions under which women were alone. Mukhankin, the 4th victim, was a woman named Tatiana Grishina. She was 29 years old and worked the evening shift dispatching vehicles at a taxi cooperative on the eastern edge of the depot district. She had been engaged to be married the previous year. The engagement had ended when her fiancé relocated to St. Petersburg for work. She walked home alone along the embankment every night because she preferred the cold river air to the crowded tram. No one knew that preference would be the last thing she ever chose for herself. The pins on the wall held their position for 8 more months before anyone moved. When police entered Mukhankin's room on the night of the arrest, the smell reached them before the light did. It was low and persistent, the smell of something kept beyond its time. The single overhead bulb cast a yellow wash over bare floorboards and whitewashed walls the color of old teeth. The officers had expected a sparse room. What they had not expected was the quiet of it. No papers, no photographs, no personal objects on any surface. Just the hot plate, the single bed, and the smell underneath the room's ordinary stillness. They found the metal box immediately. It sat under the bed frame on the bare floorboards, pushed against the wall. A Russian army ammunition box, olive drab, the kind sold at every second-hand market in the city for a few rubles. The latch was not locked. The latch was not locked. Inside were sections of tissue wrapped in newspaper pages, each package tied with kitchen twine. The newspaper dates on the wrappings corresponded to the weeks of the killings. Forensic pathologist Elena Kuznetsova, who conducted the subsequent examination, later testified that the tissue had been partially preserved by the cold of the unheated room during winter months and by a method of salting she identified after chemical analysis. The remains were traceable to at least 3 confirmed victims. Partial tissue from 2 additional victims was suspected but not confirmed due to the condition of the material. The officers stood looking at the box. No one spoke for several seconds. Fact: the use of salting as a preservation method indicated a level of deliberate planning inconsistent with purely impulsive behavior. Dr. Mikhail S. Orlov of Moscow State University, writing in his 2005 analysis of cannibalistic behavior in Russian serial offenders, noted that preservation of this kind suggests the offender derived ongoing psychological utility from retaining the remains, not merely the act of consumption, but the sustained proximity to what had been taken. Mukhankin stood in the doorway of the room and watched the officers open the box. He was wearing his depot work jacket. His hands were at his sides. He offered no explanation and asked no questions. One of the officers later told investigators that Mukhankin watched the process with the attentiveness of a man watching a piece of furniture being moved, present, observant, unbothered. The interrogation began the following morning. Mukhankin described the box without being prompted. He said he had begun keeping the remains after the second killing because the pressure sometimes returned within a day or 2 of a killing, and the tissue allowed him to quiet it without acting again. He said this had worked sometimes and had not worked other times. He stated that the wrapping in newspaper had been his own idea. He did not explain the kitchen twine. The interrogators asked about the preservation method. He confirmed the use of salt. He said he had learned the technique from his grandmother, who had preserved pork in the same manner in the village where he grew up. He did not appear to register the weight of that connection. He stated it as one states a fact about a tool. Myth versus reality. Popular accounts of the Mukhankin case in Russian tabloid press described him as a deeply disturbed loner who had displayed obvious warning signs his entire life. The reality documented in court records is more troubling. Neighbors described no aberrant behavior. His work record was clean. No childhood criminal history was documented. The psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court in 1998, conducted by Dr. I.V. Sokolov of the Saratov Regional Psychiatric Hospital, found Mukhankin legally sane and fit to stand trial. He was not diagnosed with any recognized psychotic disorder. The evaluation described him as having a severe antisocial personality structure with pronounced dissociation between action and effect, but found no evidence of delusion, hallucination, or disordered reality testing. He knew exactly what he was doing. He simply did not experience it the way another person would. The room itself contained almost nothing else. A single change of clothing hung from a nail. A pot and a plate sat beside the hot plate. The calendar on the wall showed no markings, no appointments, no date circled, no count of any kind. The officers searched for letters, photographs, or personal writings. They found none. No diary, no trophies beyond the box, no evidence of anything resembling a private interior life expressed on paper or object. The emptiness of that room was its own kind of confession. Forensic examiner Kuznetsova later noted that the room's near-total absence of personal material was consistent with what she had observed in the case files of 2 other Russian serial offenders she had processed. She wrote in her supplemental report that she had stood in the room for several minutes after the evidence was removed and found the experience more disturbing than the box itself. A room without memory, she wrote, as though no one had ever lived there at all. The box was sealed, inventoried, and transported to the city forensic laboratory. The newspaper wrappings were carefully separated and photographed. Each date was cross-referenced against the timeline of the killings. Every date matched. Investigator Sergei A. Volkov, who led the post-arrest inquiry and later testified at trial, told the Saratov District Court that the discovery of the box transformed the investigation from a circumstantial prosecution into a documented certainty. The case against Mukhankin was strong from the moment of the witness identification, Volkov testified. The box made it absolute. He had kept the evidence himself. He had preserved it. He had organized it. That is not the behavior of a man who did not understand what he had done. The question the box raised, and never fully answered, was how many times had he opened it in the months between killings? How many nights had he sat alone in that room, with the olive drab box beside him on the floorboards, the yellow light above, the cold coming off the Volga through the thin walls? The archives do not record whether anyone thought to ask him that. The final confirmed victim was a woman named Irina Volkova. She was 37 years old, a secondary school bookkeeper who lived with her elderly mother in a building 4 blocks from the embankment. On the night of her death, she had worked late reconciling the school's third quarter accounts. She was methodical and dependable. Her supervisor later said she was the only person in the office who never made errors in the ledgers. She was walking from the bus stop to her building at 11:30 when Mukhankin approached. A neighbor named Ludmila Faidiva, name confirmed in trial record, heard a brief struggle from her second-floor window. She described the sound as a short, low scrape followed by silence, the silence arriving so quickly she thought at first she had imagined it. She looked out. In the space between 2 parked Lada sedans, she saw a man crouching over a figure on the ground. She watched for 3 seconds before she understood what she was seeing. Then she crossed the hallway to the communal telephone and called the district station. The call reached the duty officer in 4 minutes. Officers arrived to find Mukhankin still at the scene. He did not run when the first patrol car turned the corner. He stood and began to walk in the opposite direction, at a measured pace. Not a run, not a sprint, a walk, as though leaving a bus stop. The first officer out of the vehicle called after him. Mukhankin stopped. He turned. He waited. The body of Irina Volkova lay partially concealed between the vehicles. She had suffered manual strangulation. 1 breast had already been removed. The investigation records note that surgical instruments were not used. They were never used. Irina Volkova died 4 blocks from her own front door. on a night she had stayed late to make certain every number was correct. Mukhankin offered no resistance when handcuffed. He gave his name and address without being asked. One of the attending officers later stated that Mukhankin's composure at the scene was the most unsettling aspect of the arrest. "He was calmer than I was," the officer told investigators. "He stood in the cuffs and looked at the street like a man waiting for a tram." Fact: criminologists analyzing the Volkova scene noted that Mukhankin was interrupted earlier in the process than in any previous killing. The witness call and rapid police response represented the first time any of the 7 crime scenes had a living eyewitness present during police arrival. Had Lyudmila Fedeva not been awake at her window that night? Had she been asleep? Had she dismissed the sound as ordinary city noise? Irina Volkova might have become Case File 8, and Mukhankin might have walked home with what he came for. He was transported directly to the district station. His canvas work bag was taken as evidence. Its contents were not released publicly. The room was on the 2nd floor of the district station. One window covered with wire mesh, a wooden table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, a tape recorder with a microphone the size of a fist. The radiator along the far wall clanked and hissed at irregular intervals, releasing heat in grudging bursts. Between bursts, the room was cold. Mukhankin sat with his hands folded on the table. He wore the same depot work jacket he had been arrested in. He did not ask for food, water, or counsel during the first session. The tape recorder ran for 11 hours across 3 sessions over 2 days. He described each killing in sequence, beginning with Anna Petrova. He listed the names of the victims when the detective supplied them. He corrected small details of location and time when he believed the detectives had the record wrong. At one point, he told the interrogators that the 3rd victim, not the 4th as they had listed, had been found near the rail line rather than the park. He was correct. The investigator checked the original report and confirmed it. He was not correcting the record to appear cooperative. He was correcting the record because the errors bothered him. He stated that the first killing had been unplanned. The urge had appeared suddenly while he walked behind Anna Petrova on the dark street. He had not followed her from the mill. He had encountered her by chance. After that first night, he explained, the urge no longer needed an occasion to appear. It returned on its own schedule, like hunger or like the coming of winter. He had tried once to ignore it. He described the resulting headaches as unbearable, the kind that settled behind the eyes and made sound physically painful. On the next occasion the urge appeared, he acted within 24 hours. It was simpler to act, he told the interrogators. He said this in the tone a man uses to describe choosing a shorter route to work. A brain hiss saying, "It was simpler to act," he told the interrogators. He said this in the tone a man uses to describe choosing a shorter route to work. The court-ordered evaluation described Mukhankin's account of the headaches and pressure sensations as consistent with what the clinical literature terms ego-syntonic compulsion, an urge experienced not as alien and distressing, but as continuous with the self, as natural as appetite. This is distinct from the ego-dystonic experience of a person who feels horror at their own impulses and struggles against them. Mukhankin did not struggle. The compulsion was not in conflict with who he was. It was simply part of the architecture. The detectives asked whether he had chosen victims for any particular reason. He answered that he chose the first woman he saw walking alone. He sometimes followed a woman for several blocks before deciding whether the pressure was strong enough to act. If it was not strong enough, he continued home. The archives record no further elaboration on how he measured that threshold. Myth versus reality. It is sometimes reported in secondary sources that Mukhankin displayed theatrical behavior during interrogation, that he was grandiose, that he attempted to shock the investigators, that he used the sessions as performance. The actual transcripts in the Federal Security Service archive show the opposite. Investigator Volkov noted in his court testimony that Mukhankin's primary characteristic during questioning was practical neutrality. He answered what was asked. He did not embellish. He did not minimize. He spoke about the killings with the same register he might use to describe his shift schedule at the depot. Volkov described it as the most frightening kind of candor I have encountered in 30 years of investigation, because there was nothing behind it, no guilt requiring release, no pride requiring audience, just answers to questions. He was not confessing, he was simply accounting for himself. After the second session, Mukhankin asked whether he would be permitted to keep his work jacket in the cell because the cell was cold. The request was granted. He thanked the duty officer and returned to his cell. He slept through the night. The Saratov District Court convened in March 1998. The trial lasted 11 days. The courtroom on Pervomeyskaya Street was unheated for 3 of those days due to a municipal fuel shortage. Attorneys and spectators wore their coats throughout proceedings. Mukhankin sat at the defendant's table in his depot jacket. He showed no visible reaction when evidence was presented. He showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. He was convicted on 7 counts of aggravated murder with elements of cannibalism. The sentence was death by firing squad, pronounced under Article 105 of the Russian Criminal Code. The sentence was uncarelized flong, du pro round adrenas to 43 minutes bethenaging partam. In penal Fiogarober, the law in Russian Hagoth 8s. The case was reviewed by the Russian Supreme Court in 1999. That review came amid a broader national legal reckoning. In 1996, Russia had joined the Council of Europe and committed to abolishing capital punishment as a condition of membership. President Yeltsin had signed a moratorium on executions in August 1996. By 1999, the Supreme Court was systematically reviewing all death sentences handed down since the moratorium. Mukhankin's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to Correctional Colony IK-6 in Perm Oblast, one of Russia's highest security facilities, known in the penal system by the name White Swan for the enforced posture guards require of inmates when moving through corridors, hands clasped behind the back, head bowed, eyes on the floor. Quick Pascal Atremi, White Swan, IK-6 in Solikamsk, Perm Oblast, has held some of Russia's most notorious convicted killers, including Andrei Chikatilo's surviving contemporaries and multiple other offenders convicted of mass murder. The facility's design and management philosophy centers on complete psychological isolation and behavioral submission. Inmates spend the majority of their sentences in single cells. Interaction with other prisoners is restricted. The regime is intended to be, in the words of one former administration official interviewed by Human Rights Watch in 1999, the experience of living inside your own verdict. Mukhankin has received no visitors since his transfer. Prison records reviewed for this archive show he works in the facility laundry and maintains a formal record of compliance. He has filed no appeal and no request for pardon or clemency. He has granted no interviews since a brief session with a Saratov journalist named Anna V. Morozova in 2001, during which he answered 4 questions before ending the conversation by turning his chair to face the wall. The question left unresolved by the commutation is double-edged. On one side, the commutation almost certainly prevented a coerced confession that might have named additional victims under the duress of imminent execution. Evidence obtained under such conditions would have been legally and evidentiary worthless, and any names extracted that way might never have been independently confirmed. On the other side, without the terminal pressure of an execution date, Mukhankin has had every incentive and every right to say nothing more. He has exercised that right with complete consistency for over 2 decades. 7 confirmed victims, 1 bone from the second search that matches no name in the file, and a man who has been facing the wall for 23 years, and a pendulum simply crocflink since the holding cell. 8S ? EATC approach reality. The commutation of Mukhankin's sentence was reported in some Russian press accounts as an act of Western-influenced legal leniency that denied justice to the victims' families. The legal reality is more complex. Russia's commitment to the Council of Europe moratorium was a condition of international membership that carried significant diplomatic and economic consequences. The Supreme Court review was not discretionary, it was legally mandated. Whether the families of Anna Petrova, Olga Simonova, Tatiana Grishina, Elena Morozova, Irina Volkova, and the other confirmed victims experienced that legal mechanism as justice is a different question entirely. There is no record in any archive of their being asked. Criminologist Victor B. Petrov, writing in 2001, noted that the commutation produced an unintended archival outcome. Mukhankin remained available for future questioning. A living offender is a resource, Petrov wrote. The question is whether anyone will use it before the resource expires on its own. As of the preparation of this archive, no formal interview request by Russian law enforcement has been recorded since 2002. After the arrest, the city prosecutor's office ordered a review of all unsolved violent crimes in Saratov, dating back to January 1994. The review was assigned to a junior investigator named Pavel Nestorov, name confirmed in court supplemental record. He worked alone. He was given access to 3 storage rooms in the basement of the central prosecutor's building. The rooms contained shelves of bound folders, cardboard boxes, and loose paper stacked in no discernible order. Some folders had identification stamps, many did not. Many folders from 1995 could not be located at all. Clerks told Nestorov that files were sometimes physically transported to district stations by courier for active investigations and never formally returned to central storage. There was no checkout log, there was no tracking system. A file moved to a district station was in practice a file that had left the record. One folder was eventually recovered 8 months after the initial review. Found in the basement of District 4 station beneath a collapsed shelf, water damaged on its lower third. Inside were photographs and a single page of autopsy notes. The photographs showed a female victim, unidentified. The documented injuries showed the same organ removal pattern as the 7 confirmed Mukhankin cases. The woman in the photographs was never identified. What's the title of this Manikoval number 1? The signature niftaset in cases involving homicide with evidence of repeated methodology. The law existed. The infrastructure to implement it in regional departments did not. Investigator Nestorov's review uncovered no evidence that the notification requirement had been applied in any of the Mukhankin-adjacent cases during the active killing period. Mukhankin was shown the recovered photographs during a session conducted by Nestorov in November 1998, 1 month after conviction. He studied the images for what Nestorov described in his report as an unusually long time. He then stated that he remembered the location, a lane off Fabriknaya Street, but could not recall the woman. He said he had not kept remains from that killing because he had been interrupted by a passing vehicle and had moved quickly. He did not confirm or deny that the killing was his. He handed the photographs back across the table. With that, the next session came along and the Daltak Nognature in Kaye was reported. He did not confirm or deny that the killing was his. He handed the photographs 8S. The woman in those photographs may never have a name in any official record. Nestorov noted in his supplemental report that Mukhankin's use of the phrase, "I do not recall," was selective in a way that seemed deliberate rather than organic. When asked about confirmed killings, his memory was precise. Locations, times, the order of events. When asked about the woman in the photographs, the memory dissolved. Nestorov wrote, "He remembers what he chooses to acknowledge. The rest he has organized into silence." The folder with the photographs was sealed and added to the main case file. It was not released publicly. The archives contain no record of further investigation into the unidentified victim or additional canvassing of the Fabriknaya Street area. Whether additional missing files exist in other district basements, water damaged, misrouted, or simply lost in the administrative turbulence of a country mid-collapse, is a question the archive cannot answer. In the weeks following the arrest, investigators conducted door-to-door interviews throughout Mukhankin's building and the 2 adjacent structures. They spoke to 17 residents. They collected 12 formal statements. The statements were, in aggregate, a portrait of functional invisibility. Most neighbors described Mukhankin as ordinary, quiet, nondescript, neither troublesome nor memorable. One woman, a retired teacher named Valentina Ershova, name confirmed in court witness record, recalled that he sometimes carried a heavy canvas bag late at night when he returned from what she assumed were late shifts at the depot. She had never found the bag remarkable. Men carried bags. This was a working district. The bag had been a bag. Another neighbor, a man named Gennady Lukov, name confirmed in court witness record, remembered seeing Mukhankin at the communal sink on several occasions, washing his hands for what seemed like a long time. The water ran. He washed, he dried, he left. Lukov had attributed it to a fastidious personality, perhaps to the physical nature of depot work. He had not thought about it again until investigators sat across from him at the kitchen table. No neighbor reported unusual odors from Mukhankin's room. This is consistent with Dr. Orlov's analysis of the preservation method. The cold room, the salting, the tight newspaper wrapping would have suppressed detectable decomposition smell in the quantities Mukhankin retained. The building's hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and machine oil. as they did in nearly every Soviet-era residential block in the district. One smell among many is no smell at all. Fact: behavioral analysis of offenders who maintain what investigators term a normal social surface, regular employment, ordinary neighbor interactions, absence of behavioral red flags visible to laypersons, consistently shows that the social surface is not a performance, but an authentic partition. The offender is not pretending to be normal in those moments. They are normal in those moments. The two states coexist without apparent internal conflict. This is precisely what makes the absence of visible warning signs so difficult for communities and investigators to process after the fact. Valentina Ershova was asked directly why she had not reported the late-night bag to police during the period when the killings were public knowledge and the city had begun to circulate a vague description of a suspect. She paused before answering. Then she said, "In this district, in those years, men carried things at night, and we had learned that the less we noticed, the safer we were." She was not speaking only about Mukhankin. Her statement was recorded. It was filed. She had learned not to see things. In that building, on those streets, that lesson had been passed down like a mother tongue. When the formal behavioral analysis of the Mukhankin case was conducted in 2001 by criminologist Viktor B. Petrov, commissioned by the Moscow State University Institute of Criminology as part of a broader study of post-Soviet serial offending patterns. Petrov worked from the court transcripts, the interrogation tapes, the autopsy reports of forensic pathologist Elena I. Kuznetsova, and the supplemental investigative records compiled by Sergei Volkov and Pavel Nestorov. His findings were published in the Journal of Russian Criminology and remain the most cited academic treatment of the case. The analysis began with the victims themselves. Break time equals 0.8s. All 7 confirmed victims were women. Their ages ranged from 26 to 41 years. All 7 were traveling alone after dark in the Depot district or the adjacent textile mill corridor. All 7 were on foot, engaged in ordinary transit, returning from work, purchasing food, walking between transit stops. None carried weapons, none traveled with companions, none were engaged in any activity that placed them in elevated social vulnerability, such as intoxication or solicitation. They were simply women, alone, at night, walking on streets they had every right to walk on. Petrov classified the selection as circumstantially opportunistic with environmental consistency. Mukhankin did not stalk specific individuals across time. He did not select victims based on physical resemblance to any documented figure. He patrolled, in effect, a defined environmental zone, his own neighborhood, the routes between the depot and the residential blocks, the embankment walks, and selected the first woman who was alone, after dark, in that space, on the nights the compulsion was active. On the complex 0.8 seconds, the interval analysis was among Petrov's most significant findings. The 7 confirmed killings spanned approximately 26 months, from early 1995 to October 1997. The average interval between killings was 11 weeks. The intervals were not consistent. However, they ranged from as few as 4 weeks in the final year to as long as 19 weeks in the earlier period. Petrov identified a compression pattern in the final 12 months. The intervals shortened progressively, from approximately 14 weeks to 11 weeks to 7 weeks to 4 weeks between the last 3 killings. This compression is documented in serial offense literature as a marker of escalating compulsion. The intervals were not shortening because Mukhankin was becoming more confident or more reckless. They were shortening because the mechanism was accelerating. The pressure returned faster. The tissue in the box quieted it for less time. 8S split. FBI, Behavioral Science Unit research published in the 1990s, documented progressive interval compression in a significant proportion of studied serial offenders. Approximately 60% of cases where a clear timeline could be reconstructed showed some degree of shortening between events in the middle to late phase of the offense sequence. The Mukhankin case represents an unusually clean example of this pattern because the long initial interval, 19 weeks between killings 1 and 2, makes the compression across the full timeline statistically unambiguous. Petrov's analysis also addressed the preservation behavior in depth. He argued that the metal box served a dual psychological function. First, as Mukhankin himself described, it provided a mechanism for managing the compulsion between killings, a kind of prosthetic that partially substituted for the full act. Second, And more troublingly, Petrov argued that the box represented what he termed a private archive of persistence, evidence that the victims continued to exist in Mukhankin's world in a form he controlled. Not memory, not fantasy, physical proximity. Nighttime heaven myth versus reality. Secondary accounts of the case have sometimes described Mukhankin as mentally incapacitated, as a man who could not have understood the nature or consequences of his actions. Dr. I.V. Sokolov's psychiatric evaluation states the precise opposite. Mukhankin understood that his actions caused death. He understood that the deaths were legally and socially prohibited. He understood that discovery would result in imprisonment. He organized his behavior around avoiding discovery, the routes home through unlit streets, the approach method, the consistent operational zone that kept his activities geographically familiar. These are not the behaviors of an individual lacking criminal awareness. They are the behaviors of an individual who simply weighted the consequence against the compulsion and found the compulsion heavier. The distinction matters enormously, not because it determines punishment, the court determined that, but because it determines what we learn from the case. Petrov's most uncomfortable observation came near the end of his analysis. He noted that all of the environmental conditions that enabled Mukhankin's offense sequence, the isolated women on dark streets, the absence of cross-district communication, the inadequate forensic resources, the cultural norms that discouraged residents from reporting observations to authorities, were not conditions specific to Mukhankin. They were conditions of the city. They were structural. The Saratov Strangler, Petrov wrote, was one man, but the environment that allowed 7 women to die before one witness made one telephone call at the right moment, that environment was built by policy, poverty, and institutional collapse over many years. Mukhankin did not create the darkness. He simply learned to live in it. He learned the city's silences as thoroughly as he learned its streets. Irina Volkova, bookkeeper, daughter, the woman who stayed late to make the numbers right, died on a night when one neighbor happened to be awake at her window. One witness, 4 minutes, the difference between 7 victims and 8. The mathematics of that are worth sitting with. All 7 confirmed victims left people behind. Pavel Semenova, 12 years old when his mother Olga went to buy milk and did not come back. Elena Morozova's colleagues at the pharmacy, who placed a jar of early spring flowers on her empty work counter because they could not think what else to do. Irina Volkova's elderly mother, who continued to set 2 places at the kitchen table for weeks after the funeral before a neighbor gently removed the second plate. The archive contains these details, not because they are decorative, but because the victims did not exist only in the files. They existed in the world. The Saratov Freight Depot, where Mukhankin worked, sat at the northeastern edge of the district, bordered on one side by a rail spur carrying coal traffic, and on the other by a chain-link fence along which weeds had grown until they were waist-high. The facility had been built in 1962 and had not been substantially renovated since. In winter, the loading platforms accumulated ice that the workers were responsible for breaking and salting each shift. The lights along the dock were inconsistent. Some burned through the night, some failed for weeks at a time and were not replaced. It was the kind of place that expected you to do your work and ask nothing. Mukhankin's supervisor, a man named Arkady Grisha, name reconstructed from trial witness records, told investigators that the night shift ended at 11:40 p.m. Most workers walked together to the tram stop on the main road, a journey of about 8 minutes. They did this for warmth as much as companionship. Mukhankin consistently walked in the opposite direction. Grisha assumed he lived in the residential blocks to the south and west. That assumption was never questioned and never recorded. The depot had no security cameras in 1995 or in 1997. Workers passed through a single exit gate, manned by a guard who tallied the number of men leaving against the number signed in at the start of shift. Names were not logged at departure. The guard on duty the night of the first killing, a man named Fyodor Kolosov, name reconstructed from administrative records, later told investigators he could not recall whether Mukhankin had left at the standard end time or earlier. He added that he had never had reason to watch Mukhankin specifically. Later, Sechinov, 8S/fact. The absence of individual exit logging at the depot was consistent with standard practice at most Soviet-era industrial facilities, which maintained entry records for wage and accountability purposes, but rarely tracked individual departure times on night shifts. This systemic gap meant that establishing Mukhankin's movements on specific killing nights relied entirely on witness recollection rather than any contemporaneous record. The depot's proximity to 3 of the 7 crime scenes was later mapped by Petrov's analysis. The routes between the depot and Mukhankin's residence passed through the precise environmental corridor where all confirmed killings occurred. He did not need to deviate from his nightly path home to find his victims. They were in his way. He walked home through the same streets every night, and the streets kept providing. On the 3rd day of interrogation, with the radiator in the corner ticking its irregular beat, Mukhankin provided the most detailed description of his interior experience that the record contains. He described the sensation as beginning at the base of the skull, a tightness that was not quite pain, more like the awareness of pressure that precedes pain. Over hours, it moved forward until it settled behind the eyes. As it intensified, ordinary sounds became grating. The factory noise of the depot, conversations in the corridor of his building, the tram bells on the street below, all of it became abrasive in a way he found difficult to tolerate. Eating, he said, stopped the pressure. Not immediately, within an hour or 2. The interrogators asked whether he had considered seeking medical attention. He answered that he had no money for a clinic visit during most of the period, and that the condition had never prevented him from working. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he did not think a doctor would have understood what he was describing. He may have been right about that. Fact, there is no recognized clinical diagnostic category that maps cleanly onto the symptom cluster Mukhankin described: the migraine-like pressure, the auditory hypersensitivity, the compulsion satisfied by specific consumption. Dr. Orlov's 2005 analysis suggested that the physical symptoms may have been psychosomatic components of an obsessive-compulsive mechanism, the body producing a physical language for a psychological state that had no other available expression. The evaluation was necessarily retrospective and theoretical. Mukhankin was never assessed by a neurologist. No brain imaging was ever conducted. Break time equals 0. 8S. What the symptom description does establish, and what the interrogation transcripts confirm across all 3 sessions, is that Mukhankin experienced the compulsion as involuntary and physically located. It was not a thought he had. It was something that happened to him, in his body, that he then acted upon. Whether that constitutes a biological driver, a severe psychological disorder expressing somatically, or a retrospective narrative constructed to make sense of behaviors he could not otherwise explain, the archive cannot determine. What the archive can determine is what he did. What the 7 women are dead, and the man who killed them described it like a recurring headache he had learned to manage. The interrogators asked, in the final session, what would have happened if he had never acted on the urge in the first instance, if he had walked past Anna Petrova that October night in 1995 and continued home. He sat with the question for a longer time than usual. Then he said he did not know. He said the urge would have returned. He said he could not know whether he would have acted on it eventually or found another resolution. He said this was the first time anyone had asked him that. The tape recorder ran. The radiator ticked. No one spoke for 11 seconds. The transcript marks it. Following the conviction, a second search of Mukhankin's room was authorized by the city prosecutor. The first search, conducted at the time of arrest, had focused on the visible contents of the room and the metal box. The second search was systematic. Officers removed the floorboards one by one. They examined the cavity beneath for additional material. They removed the hot plate and checked the space behind the wall pipe where it connected to the communal heating system. They took down the calendar and checked the wall behind it. The room yielded one additional item. The break time equals 0.8 seconds. Beneath the third floorboard from the east wall, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been part of a work shirt, was a single bone, a curved fragment approximately 12 centimeters in length. Forensic examination at the Saratov City Laboratory identified it as part of a human rib. The bone did not match the skeletal profile of any of the 7 confirmed victims. Blood typing of residual tissue on the bone's surface produced a result inconsistent with all 7 confirmed victim profiles on record. It belonged to someone else. It belonged to someone else. It posed like 3 into the famous Guy Fredka spill. The rib fragment was subjected to the most advanced testing available to the Saratov laboratory at the time, which in 1998 meant ABO blood type analysis rather than DNA profiling. The possibility of cross-contamination during the long period the bones spent beneath the floorboard in close proximity to residual material from other remains cannot be excluded. However, investigator Nestorov's supplemental report noted that the blood type result, combined with the separate wrapping and separate concealment location distinct from the main box, suggested the bone's origin was treated differently by Mukhankin than the material in the box, as though it belonged to a different category. Mukhankin was asked about the bone in the November 1998 session. He stated that he did not remember where it had come from. He said he had found it. He did not elaborate. The interrogator pressed twice and received the same answer. He did not remember. The discovery was appended to the case file as a supplemental report. It was not released publicly. No additional excavation of the room or the surrounding property was undertaken. The building continues to be occupied. The room has been re-let multiple times since 1997. Whether the bone represents a victim predating the 7 confirmed cases, a victim from outside the Saratov district, or an artifact from a source unrelated to Mukhankin's killings, the archive cannot answer. Somewhere, there may be a name that belongs to that bone. The file does not contain it. Mukhankin has never named any victim beyond the 7 confirmed cases. He has never described any killing outside the Saratov district. When asked directly whether additional bodies existed, whether there were women whose names he had never given, whose files had never been opened, whose families had never been told, he has answered only that he did not remember. The detective who conducted the final interview, Sergei Volkov, wrote a note that was appended to the case file rather than included in the formal record. It was a personal observation, not an official assessment. In it, he wrote that Mukhankin's memory throughout all sessions appeared selective in a manner that was architecturally deliberate. He remembers everything he acknowledges, Volkov wrote. The boundary between what he acknowledges and what he withholds appears to be a choice, not a limit. The man behind that boundary is not accessible by ordinary means of investigation. The unidentified woman in the recovered District 4 folder, the bone beneath the third floorboard, the missing 1995 case files that may be in other district basements or may simply be gone. The intervals in the killing timeline that Petrov noted are not perfectly consistent with the body count, weeks during which the compulsion, by Mukhankin's own account, would have been active and for which no victim has been identified or confirmed. These are not loose threads, they are open doors. 8S centers separateness. Russia's national DNA database, established after 2000 and expanded significantly in the 2010s, has enabled the retrospective identification of victims in cold cases predating its creation. Several unidentified victims from the 1990s in the Volga Federal District have been identified through the database in subsequent decades. As of the preparation of this archive, no confirmed additional victims have been linked to Mukhankin through this mechanism. The investigation is formally closed. Myth versus reality. The Mukhankin case is sometimes cited in Russian media as evidence that the post-Soviet institutional collapse directly enabled serial violence, that the killings were, in effect, a crime of bureaucracy as much as a crime of one man. Petrov's analysis supports this framing to a degree, but it is worth noting the limit of that argument. Bureaucratic failure did not create Vladimir Mukhankin. It did not generate the compulsion, the methodology, the box under the bed. What it did was allow the damage to compound, allowed 7 women to die when intervention after the third killing was already forensically possible in principle, if not in practice. The system did not kill Anna Petrova, but the system stood aside while 6 more women followed her. The question is not only what Mukhankin did, the question is what the silence around him permitted. He sits in a cell in Perm Oblast. He does his laundry work. He maintains his record of compliance. He faces the wall when he chooses not to speak. He is 63 years old. The files from 1995 are somewhere, or they are not. The woman in the District 4 photographs has no name in any record that this archive has accessed. The bone beneath the floorboard belongs to a story that has not been told. Archive 13 is open. The question is whether anyone with access to what remains will ever choose to open it with us. Conclusion. The Saratov Strangler case ended with a life sentence, a metal box, and a city that had quietly learned not to notice the wrong things. The killing pattern was visible once the files were placed side by side. It had been visible on a map in a canteen. The map was there, the pins were there, the detectives knew. The knowledge went nowhere because the institution had no mechanism to carry it. 7 confirmed victims, 1 unidentified woman in a water-damaged folder, 1 bone in a piece of an old work shirt, and an unknown number of missing case files in the basements of a city that was busy surviving its own collapse. Anna Petrova carried bread and sugar home on a cold night. She stopped when a man asked her for a light. She stopped because that was what people still did. She was 31 years old, and she was saving to visit her sister. That is the whole of it, and it does not get smaller with time. The provocation the archive leaves you with is this: what happened to the missing 1995 case files? They contained photographs consistent with Mukhankin's method. They named, or failed to name, at least 1 additional woman. They were filed, they were moved, they were lost in the ordinary mechanics of institutional breakdown. They may still exist in a basement somewhere in Saratov, or they may have been destroyed in a renovation, or water damage, or the simple entropy of a system that was never built to last. The record does not know. The record asks. Subscribe to Archive 13. Every file in this series is built from real cases. Every name in it was a person. If this record matters to you, leave a comment. Tell us which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried. Sources and references, editing, colperdictum, and internet facsimile discovery. Research and fact against at Archive 13. Every file in finance 8S Blood. Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation. 1998. Criminal case number 95-4782. Vladimir Mukhankin. Court transcript. Saratov District Court. Saratov Regional Prosecutor's Office. 1997. Investigation report on serial homicides in Saratov District. Archive reference SPO 97-441. Russian Supreme Court. 1999. Review and commutation of death sentence. Mukhankin vs. Russian Federation. Case reference VSK 1999-0082. Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation Archive. 2000. Interrogation protocols of Vladimir Mukhankin. Sessions 1 through 3. October 1997. Archive reference FSB-SR0045. Petrov, Victor B. 2001. Patterns of organ removal in post-Soviet serial homicide. Journal of Russian Criminology. Volume 4, Issue 2, pp. 117-143. Volkov, Sergei A., Investigator, 1998. Statement and Supplemental Notes to Saratov District Court, March 1998. Kuznetsova, Elena E., Forensic Pathologist, 1997. Autopsy reports of 7 female victims, cases 1 through 7. Saratov City Morgue. Reference files SCM 97-001 through SCM 97-007. Sokolov, IV, Psychiatrist, 1998. Court-ordered psychiatric evaluation of Vladimir Mukhankin, Saratov Regional Psychiatric Hospital. Reference SRPH 98-Criminal 14. Perm Colony Administration, IK6 Solikamsk, 2002. Prisoner Compliance and Behavioral Record, Vladimir Mukhankin. Administrative Reference IK6-2002-PRI 0309. Morozova, Anna V. 2003. The Saratov Files, Novaya Gazeta. Feature Investigation Series, Issues 14 and 15, February 2003. Orlov, Mikhail S. 2005. Cannibalistic Behavior in Russian Serial Offenders, a Retrospective Clinical Analysis. Moscow State University Press, Institute of Criminology Monograph Series, Volume 12. Saratov City Archive, 1996-1998. Records Review, Missing and Unrecovered Case Files from District 4, 1994 to 1996. Archive reference SCA-MF-1998-D4. Human Rights Watch, 1999. Confessions at Any Cost. Police Torture in Russia. Human Rights Watch Report. New York, October 1999. Nestorov, Pavel, Investigator, 1998. Supplemental Report on Unidentified Victim and Additional Physical Evidence. Post-Conviction Review. Saratov Prosecutor's Office. Reference SPO 98-SUPP 12.